Welcome. Today we are continuing our discussion of consequentialism. Specifically, we're going to look at utilitarianism, moving beyond just the individual notions of egoism and the hedonism that might be connected with that. And we're also going to broaden this out to what I call theistic hedonism. Maybe we didn't like some of the arguments of hedonism, but we might want to add in an extra layer and realize that some of you might be, by saying, no, I don't care about pleasure, but I only care about going to heaven, might be theistic hedonists. And I'll introduce this concept later on. One of the great challenges to hedonism is the question of, if all that I care about is pleasure, do my experiences really matter? There's this idea that's known as the experience machine problem that is a pushback against all of this. Does it matter if the experiences you have that give you pleasure are real or imagined? Would you enter into a machine that is giving you any experience you want if it was all fake? If the relationships weren't real? If the impact that you had was imagined and perceived and not anything else? Does it matter if the whole thing is a lie? For some of us, we're going to give a little pushback and go, yeah, if my experiences are all a lie, then what good are they? What good is my memory? What good is life if none of it is based on anything that's real? And this is what the experience machine problem poses. One of the three normative ways of addressing ethical theories is consequentialism, the other deontology, which we'll get to later, and virtue ethics, which we've already addressed. So we end up having these three different branches. But consequentialism really has the most nuance in it. Because the question really is which consequences do we care about? Should you care only about yourself? Is it all about you? Right? What are the things that are going to affect me, as egoism advocates? Or is it about the greatest number of people, which generally utilitarianism is going to advocate for, right? And so we can kind of see this big sort of question. Is it me? Is it everybody? Is it me and somebody else? Where's the line? How do we divide this? Which choices do we end up making? Which consequences do we pay attention to? Can I just say it doesn't matter what happens to you? Because at the heart of the consequences are those that are affecting me. I'm only concerned about you in as far as it affects me. Or are my consequences really not important at all because it's important to you and them? And therefore, more of you are going to enjoy this than just me, so I lose out. That becomes kind of the heart of the debate within consequentialism. Whose consequences do we care about? Now, the earlier proponent for consequentialism under a utilitarian idea is a man by the name of Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832. Bentham ends up advocating that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. We've already encountered this idea within hedonism, but this becomes the idea here for Bentham, right? That pain and pleasure govern us in all that we do, all that we say, all that we think. Every effort we can make to throw off all of our subjugation will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it, according to Bentham, right? That you want to avoid pain and that you want pleasure, and that this is not just unique to you, but this is unique to all humanity. In fact, Bentham, if he was wanting to expand on this, could say that this is the case for everybody, for all creatures, right? Animals as well as humans. Now, Bentham ends up addressing this idea of pleasure and pain through what he's going to identify as the principle of utility. He says, by the principle of utility, it is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or, what is the same thing, in other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness, right? So utility, which utilitarianism will derive its name from, really just kind of means Is this going to be something that's going to help me or others, as the discussion ends up going, to be more happy or less painful, or is it going to do the opposite, right? So do I take a hammer and hit my thumb? No. Right? Why? Because that's not going to result in my happiness. It's going to result in my lack of happiness, primarily pain. And therefore, I am averse to that idea. Now, it should be, in many ways, you might think, just as simple as that. Is this going to do something that's going to cause more pain, less pain, more pleasure, less pleasure, and you might just have a gut feeling that this is going to be how it is. But utilitarianism really says that's not quite right. That what we're going to understand is that there's a lot more involved than just that first gut reaction of whether or not you think something is going to cause more pain or more pleasure. In fact, Bentham ends up creating what he's going to call a hedonistic calculus, that we're going to end up doing some sort of math equations involved in deciding whether or not something is going to cause more pain or more pleasure, and therefore which is the action that's right. And so sometimes a same action might be different because different people are involved, and there's different factors in that same equation that it kind of tips it from absolutely not, you shouldn't do that, to yes, indeed, you should. Right? The idea under hedonistic calculus is that the right thing to do is that action, singular action, that was going to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And this, for Bentham, is for the most people involved. Now, as I said, there's a cost-benefit analysis wrapped up into this. There's math. And so Bentham's calculus, this hedonistic calculus that he's advocating for, has got 7 different components to it. Right, so there's a lot of floating figures that you're going to have to keep in mind in deciding whether or not any action is ethical or not. First is to look at notions of intensity. How strong will the pleasure or pain be? Right, so again, this is why, right, if I hit myself in the thumb with a hammer, I've got a fairly high threshold for pain. You might not. It might be more okay for me to hit myself in the thumb with a hammer than it is for me to hit you in the thumb with a hammer, just because it's more intense for you than it is for me. And again, we'll have other things adding into this. Duration. How long will it last? Right? If I was to injure you to the point that it's going to last for weeks or months, this is going to be a worse action. Similarly, if something is going to give pleasure, that's going to be a lasting sort of pleasure. That's going to have more value for Bentham than just a fleeting pleasure that's going to go away. Right, so whether or not you pass up on the cheesecake to stick to your diet, right? The cheesecake might give you a lot of pleasure, but right, the diet duration is the whole idea of the reason why you're doing that, right? Why you're going to turn away that momentary gratitude from that. Certainty. How certain are you going to be that pleasure or pain is going to follow? Certain things you know are going to be the case. You know if I hit you in the thumb with a hammer, it's going to hurt. That's not a questionable thing. You're not unsure about that. You might be unsure with some other things that have got ethical weights, right? Do you leave in the middle of the night and go out to a party, right? Well, you're not certain, is this going to be a good time or not? You might know some things, you might know some of the people, but you might not. Right? And so when you're weighing out the whether or not going out late at night for the party is the ethical decision, is it going to give you more pleasure than sleeping or doing schoolwork or something else along those lines, right? The certainty part makes a big difference, right? Are you certain that you're going to be able to get your work done? Are you certain that you'll be able to sleep in the morning? Are those sorts of things outweigh the certainty of the enjoyment from that, let alone the ideas of durations and intensity that we've also talked about. Propinquity is also important for Bentham. Now, propinquity is not a word that most of you throw around. It really means how soon will it occur. For Bentham, pleasures that are more immediate, that we know are going to happen sooner, have greater value than those that are going to be put off for a long time. And this has got something to do also with notions of certainty and also intensity, right? And we know that if a pleasure is right now, we're certain about it, it's more intense. So therefore, notions of perpetuity have got a greater value. On the other end, something that's, well, in a year you're going to enjoy this, that certainty level goes down, that intensity goes down, that duration might go down, and therefore it is of lower weight. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value to wait, right? Are you going to save up so you can go on a really nice vacation, right? This is something you're saving up and sacrificing for the long term, for something that's maybe a year or longer out. And again, Bentham's not saying that it doesn't have value, but if you could go on that vacation in a week as opposed to in 3 years, that one has got greater utility. Again, because of other, competing and involved factors like how certain are you going to be, what is the duration, intensity, etc. Fecundity is the next step involved, whether this is going to lead to more pleasure or more pain. We know that there are certain actions that are going to lead to more pleasure or lead to more pain, sometimes of the same type, some type of different types, which is the notion of purity. Right? If I hit you in the thumb with a hammer, I know that that's going to lead to more pain if I actually injure you. Right? That anytime you're going to move your thumb for the next little while, there's going to be pain involved on that. And so it's not a good thing. Similarly, though, on the other end, if we look at it as do you pass on the cheesecake, right? Is it going to lead to more pleasure or more pain? Well, the healthier you are, the more in shape you are, the more you get to enjoy life. And again, the intensity of some of that might not be an equal line, neither that, but the duration could be a lot longer. The purity is of a different sort of type, right? Enjoying a food versus just feeling healthier are two different things, but you wrap all of that in there as well. All right, so we've got fecundity and purity. Next is extent, and this is what really differs utilitarianism from just notions of egoism. Egoism is really looking at all of these same sorts of things, maybe a quick gut reaction, but would still be able to do all of these, but is primarily concerned about yourself. For utilitarianism, the extent, right, how many people are going to be affected. Right? If 2 people are going to enjoy something, it's got greater value than just one person enjoying it. If 2 people enjoy it and one person doesn't, that, the 2 people's enjoyment, as long as its intensity, duration, etc., are all equal, are going to be different. Now, again, this becomes rather tricky because everything becomes a cost-benefit analysis. If I'm going to choose to hit you in the thumb with a hammer, and it's just you and I involved, well, the extent is fairly low. The amount of pleasure I get out of hitting you in the thumb with a hammer is probably going to be fairly minimal. The amount of pain you get is fairly great. The intensity, duration, certainty, all of these factors really say that it's a bad idea for me to hit you in the thumb with a hammer. But on the other hand, if we've got a classroom full of people or an auditorium full of people, and I can minimize the amount of pain that I get from hitting you in the thumb with the hammer, and everyone gets a little bit of enjoyment watching that, right? Slapstick comedy is a thing, and they all enjoy it. Well, the number of people who are enjoying me hitting you in the thumb with a hammer being greater total amount of pleasure that's accumulated than the amount of pain that you have, all of a sudden, this action, which would be unethical if it's just you and me, becomes the moral duty of me to hit you in the thumb with a hammer because more people will enjoy it, right? So again, for Bentham, it's this notion of extent is really important because it's going to multiply or divide the amounts of pains or pleasures. And therefore, the equations at the end of Bentham's calculus, this hedonistic calculus, is different. And so what you're going to do and how you're going to move forward is different. Now, key to Bentham's calculus is the idea that this is done for every individual act, right? This is why Bentham's utilitarianism is often called act utilitarianism. There's another type of utilitarianism we'll get to in a moment. But every act needs to go through this same process, right? Do I hit you on the thumb with the hammer? Yes or no? I'm running through these 7 steps of Bentham's calculus. Same thing of the do you go out to the party? Right? You're going to run through intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, vicinity, purity, extent, right? How strong is the pain or pleasure going to be from this party? It could be a really good party. It could be a lot of pleasure. How long is it going to last? I know so-and-so is throwing the party. These usually last for, X amount of hours. Certainty, are we going to be fairly certain that there's going to be pain or pleasure? Yes, maybe if you take that one last drink, you need to redo this equation, but right? Propinquity, how soon will it occur? Right when I go out. Vicinity, whether it's going to lead to more pain or more pleasure, right? The relationships I gain from this, the fact that I'm here, the associations I get are going to lead to more pleasure of this type. If you've got a hangover because you overdid it, that's going to lead pain of that type, right? You got to weigh these things out. Purity, is it going to be the same type of pleasure or pain wrapped up within this party? What you're going to do, how many people are going to be affected, and so sometimes for a party there's a multiplying factor, sometimes not, depending on what you're going to do, right? Same thing, do you go out on a date with somebody? Intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, vicinity, purity, extent. You're going to run through all of these things. And while somebody's asking if you'd like to go out on a date, or you're considering whether or not, right, they might have lost interest. This could take a little while, right? Do you choose pizza or a sandwich for lunch? You're going to run through that exact same sort of equation, right? You're going to go through that entire list. And we see immediately the drawback of act utilitarianism is that it's going to take a while if you're really doing this in all earnestness. There's also a lot of times you're not sure how certain are you going to be that the pain or pleasure is going to follow, right? You're going to try a pizza at a new place. It could be really great or it could be garbage. And you're like, so, right, do you spend the money to go do this? Do you go out? Do you spend the time, etc., right? Is this the right choice? Or do you stick with the same thing that you know? The pleasure it's certainty. You know what it is, as opposed to everything else. But again, everything takes time, and there's new factors, right? If I was to punch you in the face, we would generally see again that this is wrong. But if we're boxing or involved in MMA or something else, there's a different category, right? The fact that you're going to get hit changes some of these things. The fact that you've walked in voluntarily into the boxing ring, you've got a different sort of engagement with that. Oftentimes, too, this is for a greater extent, or vicinity is going to lead to more pleasure or more pain. Greater number of people are going to watch, even if we're just sparring, that we're both going to be better at this, and more pleasure is going to follow for both of us as a result of it. Right? And again, there's a lot of little factors. If you're boxing but you weren't free to choose it, then again, that changes the equation, as opposed to you're getting paid, or you're going to get paid a lot versus just a little. All right, so again, every act, even if it's the same act in the same area, could look very different depending on all of the other factors involved. And so again, this takes time. Rule utilitarianism is the other type of utilitarianism, and it really grew up because it looked at act utilitarianism and said, this is going to take too long, right? That I'd like to know what I'd like to do, and I don't want to spend my entire life just analyzing every single moment, right? So unlike act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism develops rules. You're going to have rules, and you're going to follow the rules that will generally lead to the greatest amount of good, happiness, and least amount of evil, pain. Right? So we're not looking at this as a single individual act, but as a rule, is this okay? As a rule, is it okay for you to go out to a party when you've got no other obligations? Probably. As a rule, is it okay for you to do that if you've got a paper due early in the next morning and right, then maybe not. Right? So again, you can look at the same sort of idea and change some of these things. As a rule, is it okay to hit somebody? No. As a rule, is it okay to hit somebody if they're volunteering for it for, an MMA match, etc.? Yes. Right? And we don't have to run through all of this in these discussions. As a rule, is it okay to try a new food? Certainly. Right? These sorts of things, instead of just running through all of the general categories. As a rule, is it okay to kill somebody? No. Now, again, with the problem with utilitarianism was following the rules is sometimes we like exceptions to our rules. And how do you mix that? How do you shape that in? And how do you know between fairly similar things which rule is going to dominate? There's also another basic difference between act and rule utilitarianism, and that's looking at the issues of quality of pleasures or quantity of pleasures. Mill, who becomes the advocate for rule utilitarianism, we'll talk about in a minute, advocates for a higher quality of pleasure rather than a high quantity of pleasure that Bentham advocates. So even though we're looking at the same basic idea of utility, we're going to notice very quickly that different types of utilitarianism, even though they're generally trying to have more pleasure and least amount of pain, still have some nuance and development between these. John Stuart Mill really becomes the champion of rule utilitarianism, to the point that this is kind of the dominant force in how people are going to look and address the ideas going forward. Rule utilitarianism is kind of almost more utilitarian than act utilitarian, even though act utilitarianism is going to value every single act, because rule utilitarianism is, as a general rule, easier to follow than act utilitarian. So again, it's this kind of weird, tricky thing. But John Stuart Mill might become more famous than Bentham in many ways, and more associated closely with ideas of utilitarianism for the wider culture. But he's not necessarily the easiest person to read or understand. He opens his discussion on utilitarianism by stating that the truths which ultimately are accepted as the first principles of science are really the last results of metaphysical analysis, practiced on the elementary notions with which the science is conversant. And their relation to science is not that of the foundations of an edifice, but the roots of a tree, which may perform their office equally well, though they never be dug down and exposed to light. But though in science the particular truths precede the general theory, the contrary might be expected to be the case with a practical art, such as morals or legislation. Now again, if you parse this out, you probably understand what Mill is saying, that basically science begins with a certain expectation and understanding of metaphysical ideas. And that this becomes not just the foundation, but it's kind of its own growing, evolving field, right? Metaphysics doesn't disappear because we have physics. That there's a relation between these two, what's real and what's really real, and how do we understand this and that and the other. But we understand as kind of the beginning point of the scientific inquiry that other people exist. This is a metaphysical idea. Right? We could read, Descartes and the Meditations on questioning whether or not this is going to be and where we're going to start from and where we're going to proceed. But scientifically, we're going to accept that other people exist. We're going to accept that other beings other than ourselves can experience pleasure and pain, that this is not something that is only done in you or only in your mind. And that, therefore, every other scientific endeavor that's going to be done is going to follow this. And so, this is the case in science. He says, we might expect something to be a little bit different with practical arts, such as morals or legislation, but he's going to even build on from all of that, For issues of morality, whether or not you experience pleasure or pain is still based upon that metaphysical analysis that other people can. Mill expands on this a little bit more when he states that all action is done for the sake of some end. Right? We're going to get in our car because we're wanting to go somewhere, or maybe just enjoy the drive. But there's that enjoyment in the drive within all of that. We're going to pass laws because we're going to expect that that's going to achieve some sort of goal. We're going to mix this chemical with that chemical because we're wanting the result of this other chemical, or to see what happens if it's going to achieve some other sort of, goal in mind. And he's going to say that this is also the case for rules of actions. Mill continues stating, it seems natural to suppose that these must take their whole character and color from the end to which they are subservient. Right? Mill is advocating very much, from the position that morals and legislation, all rules that we're going to construct, are not done just for those rules themselves, but for the end of what we're going to do this, right? He's championing the idea of consequentialism. What are the consequences of this act? This is what's going to give something value. Is it going to be good or bad? And so we're going to combine this with the principle of utility that Bentham ended up advocating and creating a new version of utilitarianism, building on this with a strong emphasis on the consequences being what matters. Mill ends up advocating for what he's going to call the greatest happiness principle. In many ways, this is just what he's going to call the notion of utilitarianism, and it really kind of assumes many of the same ideas that Bentham had already advocated and articulated with his calculus, but does so in a much more condensed and easy to understand way. He ends up arguing that the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals, utility, notion of utilitarianism, or the greatest happiness principle, which he's going to wrap this all up together, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So if you're wanting to know if an action is good or bad, does this action tend to promote happiness, or does it tend to promote the reverse of happiness? Does it tend to produce pleasure, or does it not? Right, so notice that here we're looking at notions of happiness specifically, not just pleasure or pain, although these obviously have a correlation to happiness. Mill is really looking at this idea of, does an action tend to do so, right? As a rule, does this promote happiness or not? Now, what's interesting as we kind of dive into Mill and his discussions here, there's a lot of similarities that he's going to have with Aristotle. Even though Aristotle is not advocating for a utilitarianism, he's advocating for virtue ethics, we do see a lot of borrowing from this, right? That we're looking at a final end, right? And for Aristotle, this end was eudaimonia, right? This flourishing, this happy life. And so Mill is also wanting to look at a happy life and a complete life in a sort of way. Although, again, Aristotle was looking at this for the individual, while Mill is looking at this for everybody else. They're looking at notions as they apply to final ends. And also, Mill will advocate that you need to be cultivated to generally appreciate higher qualities of pleasures. That, right, this became the key idea for virtue ethics with Aristotle. Both also believe that you must have some help in figuring out what's going to produce the greatest amount of happiness, or as Aristotle referred to it as virtue, but go about it differently, right? So we see some similarities between these ideas. And definitely Mill had the benefit of reading Aristotle and being able to bring in many of the virtue ethics ideas within his notion of utilitarianism. Now again, we have this same sort of basic division between quality of pleasures versus quantity of pleasures. And you should probably think, before we even go farther, which one would you rather have? Do you want to have a high quality of pleasure or a high quantity of pleasures? And why? There's different values that you might see in both. There's costs involved with both. Mill ends up advocating that if I'm asked what I mean by the difference of quality in pleasures, Or what makes one pleasure more valuable than another, merely as a pleasure, except that it's being in greater amount? There's but one possible answer. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all have experience of both, give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. So, briefly, if everyone, or most people, have the option between A and B, if everyone says B is greater than A, and there's not any reason, right? It's not that A is evil, that you're trying to avoid it, or something else like that, or is out of fashion, then he's going to say B is greater. He expands upon this by stating that few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals, for a promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool, no instructed person an ignoramus. No person of feeling and conscience would be selfish and base, even though they should be persuaded that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with their lot in life than with theirs. Your dog, assuming you have a dog, has great pleasure whenever you return home, has great pleasure smelling something which you may or may not find enjoyable. Right? And the amount of pleasure that dogs get is going to be greater than what you get. I've had the privilege of raising beagles from time as our family pet, and they get just supreme enjoyment out of running and chasing rabbits. Right? This is what they're bred to. This is what their instinct tells them. This is what they are wrapped up in. This is their entire life, is for this idea, even though we didn't really go rabbit hunting, they just had some around our neighborhood. Right? But the amount of pleasure they'd get is greater than the amount of pleasure I get from a lot of things. Now, do I wish to change my lot in life to be my dog, who is, howling and baying and chasing after rabbits and enjoying that? Probably not, because I have other things that I enjoy as being more intelligent, even though there's more stresses and other things wrapped up within that. Mill's going to say that this would be the case. Another sort of example that you guys might have between notions of quantity and quality of pleasures that kind of makes it a little bit difficult. Would you rather I give you a bottle of 2014 Opus 1 retailing for around $325, or a bottle of $2 Chuck, right? $2 or $3 for Charles Shaw. Opus 1 is really nice, refined, great flavor, good balance, everything else. $2 Chuck, it's drinkable. It's fine. You might end up with a little more of a headache drinking one than the other. Right? Most of you are going to say, as a general impulse, I would rather the bottle, if it's going to be given to me as a gift, for $325 than the one that costs $2 to $3. Right? So again, you're going to look at that a little bit differently. Now, right, the quality of one is noticeably better in one than the other. Does it change, though, if I say, how about 10 bottles of $2 Chuck? How about a case? Right? You go ahead and get 12. That's $24, $36, depending on locality, versus still $325. This might, for some of you, just the whole notion of quality might change your perception. Right? Who's enjoying this bottle? Is it you and a loved one on a nice date, or is this you and 30 of your closest friends? At which point the math changes, right? How much enjoyment am I going to get versus not? And so we can almost see some of that debate between act and rule utilitarianism wrapped up in there. Now, there's other things that you might even consider on which one you might prefer. Many of you might be in the financial situation that $325 is a lot of money. I know that's definitely the case for me. And just deciding to spend that on a single bottle of wine in the future, it is a really big cost that is likely not going to happen. Well, what if I madly fall in love with the way the Opus One costs? Am I going to be satisfied drinking a $8, $10 bottle of wine? Maybe not. Maybe it's going to ruin my enjoyment of what I normally have. What, on the other hand, if you give me, a bottle of $2 Chuck, my enjoyment over that at the moment won't be as great, but I'll be able to enjoy it more when I'm drinking my other stuff, right? What does it do to future enjoyment? That other stuff that's spending, $7 on a bottle of wine. Like, well, this stuff's fantastic in comparison to the $2 that you spent on the other, right? And there can be a big difference in lasting notions of pleasures on what you're going to do. Now, again, you weigh all of these things in there, and sometimes these are right without moral considerations. You might prefer one for the other for the extent, and not just for the single moment. What about if I offered you either the bottles of wine or a gallon of gas to huff out of a sack? Most of you, I would hope all of you, are going to prefer the wine to huffing gas and sniffing gas, because that's, not very good for your brain, etc., right? That we're going to want to avoid those sorts of pleasures. Now, is this something that might be pleasurable? There's people that do it, so I'm assuming some find it enjoyable. Is this something that you theoretically should enjoy, right? This becomes even part of that discussion that we had with Mill, right? Of the how many people, right, would choose to do this without the feeling of moral obligation, right? You're going to say, no, it's not a moral obligation that I have to have the wine instead of the gas, but, maybe a practical one of where I'm going to be and how I'm going to do this, right? So you're going to have different sorts of ideas weighing in on the quality of pleasures. In fact, the lady here pictured might enjoy huffing gas more than you would enjoy the bottle of Opus One, and the cost is noticeably a lot less, and it's found everywhere, and you don't need an ID for it or any of these other things. But again, all things considered, there's a greater value found in one to the other, right? The quality of pleasure matters, not just the quantity of what's going to be involved with all of that. And so as we see within our discussion of utilitarianism, there are merits of both act and rule utilitarianism, and which ones we want to see if something is okay or not okay. Rule utilitarianism is, as a general rule, easy. You can decide, right? Do I hit somebody? No. As a rule, that's not going to lead to more happiness. It's going to lead to more pain and less pleasure. Although, again, we're going to have different things wrapped up into notions. If we're going to look at true utility, we might look at the number of people who are going to enjoy you hitting somebody and change your mind on all of that. That the equations can change. There's a lot of ease wrapped up in rule that you don't necessarily see that when it's with act utilitarianism. A couple of examples to look at too. Is it okay to lie? As a rule, we would all say, no, it's not okay to lie, right? That lying as a general rule is going to promote less happiness in the world than telling the truth would. But what about to save somebody's life? If your lie is going to save somebody's life, right? Actually, for act utilitarianism says, absolutely, go ahead and do that. How about to get out of work? Well, that's going to change it, right? Act utilitarianism, you're going to run through that calculus again, and you're going to say, maybe it is okay to lie to get out of work. How certain are you going to be to get caught, etc., etc.? What's the lie look like? Maybe it's okay to lie to get out of work. Rule utilitarianism would say it's not. Is it okay to lie just because you can? Just because it's fun to lie to people? Probably not, right? The amount of pain that they're getting versus the amount of pleasure you're getting, if you're just going to become a habitual liar, might not be the best idea. How about to steal? As a rule, no. Can we think of instances when it's okay to steal? If you're starving to feed yourself, then maybe. How about just because it's easier than work? Well, then that changes that, right? Are you able to work and you're just choosing not to? Then maybe stealing's not okay. Because you like it, because it's free stuff? Probably not, right? There's other people getting involved. The amount of pain that's wrapping up to all of them is going to be different. Is it okay to kill somebody? As a rule, no. How about to save one person's life? What if both people are innocent? Does that change? How about save two lives? What if it's to save your own life? What is to save hundreds of lives? Right? So again, we might say that at a certain point for act utilitarianism, there are times when you have to. It is the moral thing to do to kill somebody, as opposed to other sorts of ethical theories that would say it's never okay. And so again, we kind of find the squishiness wrapped up within utilitarianism. And then, of course, we have other sorts of moral obligations with trade-offs, because rarely is it ever just, do I lie, do I steal, do I kill? But is it better to lie or to kill? And different notions of utilitarianism can wrap this up, right? Do I lie instead of killing somebody? Is that generally seen as the more ethical thing to do? Because the amount of pain versus pleasure wrapped up within all of that. How about stealing versus lying? Like somebody stole the T out of that sign, right? Is that okay to do? Or versus lying? Do I lie and tell somebody that I'm starving and therefore they're going to give me that food instead of me stealing it? Is that more ethical than me just stealing it because I want it? Can you harm someone to bring about pleasures for others? Is that okay? Or harm an innocent person to win a war? Right? We have different sorts of questions that utilitarianism, both act and rule, might answer differently and might kind of promote one idea over the other. And so again, we have values wrapped up within all of these things that we can kind of look at and address. So, there's things about, right, there's not a single answer even within utilitarianism on what is okay and what is not. Well, utilitarianism has definitely its value and its merits. There are some definite challenges to notions of utilitarianism. One is wrapped up in what's often referred to as the experience machine. This is a challenge to hedonism as a general rule, but if hedonism is the basis of utilitarianism in many ways, right, hedonistic calculus, that is the principle of utility, according to Bentham and Mill. If what really matters is your pain and your pleasures, doesn't matter if these pains or pleasures are real. And many of us might say yes, but maybe not. Right? If I could put you in a machine, this goes back to Robert Nozick and his idea of the experience machine. If I could put you in a machine and this is where you're going to spend the rest of your life, and in this machine you will have all of the experiences that are anything you would ever want, all pleasurable, no pain. That if you wish you were a great vocalist, you're now a great vocalist. If you wish you had the talent to do whatever thing it is you want to do, you want to sail around the world and never worry about money. You want to, fall in love with somebody who is your perfect match, etc. And you can have all of the experiences, and this machine is able to do all of this. And, maybe it gives you just the right amount of pain that your pleasures are more intensified if this is a concern that you have. But would you go in this machine? And most of you would say, no, I wouldn't go in this machine, right? That it's not just about pain versus pleasure, but you want something real. And so, right, some of you are going to say that this is essential to your notions as well, and that this is a real challenge for utilitarianism, that if it's just about what's going to give the most people the most amount of pleasure and least amount of pain, and it's just the consequences that have value, maybe there's some other challenges wrapped up, that a virtual reality world isn't real enough, and therefore your pleasure isn't going to be great. Some of you would be perfectly happy with this, some of you wouldn't. Another challenge is what's often wrapped up within utilitarianism is the argument of a utility monster. Utility monster is an interesting sort of concept, but if it's about the most pleasure and least amount of pain for the most individuals, what do you do if somebody gets intense amount of pleasure in destroying something? That their destruction of whatever, in the comic book here, the pipes, is greater than the amount of pain that you'd get from putting it back together and dealing with the consequences of all of this. Right? That destruction could end up being greater. Now, what if somebody is sadistic and they get a lot of pleasure out of causing a lot of pain, but they're able to do it in such a way that, their pleasure is greater than the pain affected by everybody else? Is that okay? Is it okay to rob from Bill Gates because he's got the money, as opposed to your roommate, who probably doesn't have as much money as Bill Gates in all likelihood? All right, does that change that idea? And therefore, is it okay for many of us to go and rob Bill Gates and Elon Musk and all of these other rather wealthy people? Does this make it okay to just go and take their stuff? Because our pain by not having this and their pain from having it lost aren't equal, right? That our pleasure out of getting it is greater than the pain that they have that they lose it. Does this make it okay? And so this becomes one of the challenges of utilitarianism. If we're looking at the greatest amount of pain and least amount of pleasure, we have these issues of, does it have to be real? And can we allow for things like the utility monster, who wants to just take everything wrapped up within all of that? There's another basic challenge to utilitarianism and hedonism overall, put forward by people like George Orwell and Dostoevsky, who want to end up advocating that we're not just wanting pleasure, that there are those who actually want pain. Dostoevsky argues that sometimes people just want to destroy things. Orwell, in his commentary on Mein Kampf, calls Hitler an absolutely horrible person, because he was, but also says that he understood the falsity of the hedonistic attitude of life. That there might be some benefits to democracy, but there's also some value in economic theories of fascism, because they understand where socialism and even capitalism, he says in a grudging way, that people say, I offer you a good time. Hitler said to them, I offer you a struggle, danger, and death. And as a result, a whole notion flings itself at his feet. Perhaps later on they'll get change of it and change their minds, but at the end of the last war, after a few years of slaughter and starvation, greatest happiness of the greatest number is a good slogan. But at this moment, Orwell says, better an end with horror than a horror without end. That this becomes the winning idea. And so that we're almost lose the emotional appeal if we're saying we're all in this together and we're wanting to do good. That there's sometimes this idea that people want to struggle. One of the reasons why you want to stay in real experiences is that you want to struggle more. And that it's not just about what's going to be the greatest happiness for the greatest number. It's not that you should sacrifice yourself because everyone else is going to say that they're going to enjoy it. That there might be internal value and internal worth. I want to advance an idea that's not necessarily fitting in all of the other boxes. And this is an idea of hedonism that moves beyond just whether or not something feels good on this sort of Epicurean idea. And even though that has some restraint because you're looking at greater good, there are those that might even argue that the greatest good and the happiness that we're really seeking after again, has its rooting and grounding in God. People like St. Thomas Aquinas advocate this. Technically, there is no such thing as theistic hedonism, and what Aquinas articulates is a modification of hedonism with a perspective on God fulfilling the things that are real to create a real happiness. He states, consequently, the first principle of practical reason is one founded in the notion of good, that is, good, that is, the things that we're seeking after. Hence, this is the first precept of the law, that good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. All other precepts of natural law are based upon this, so that whatever the practical reason naturally apprehends as man's good or evil belongs to the precepts of natural law as something that is to be done or something that's to be avoided. So, what is good? Where are we going to get this? He states, I answer that the will is a rational appetite. Now, every appetite is only of something good. Therefore, just as the natural appetite tends towards good existing in a thing, so the animal or the voluntary appetite tends towards a good which is apprehended. Consequently, in order that the will tend to anything, it is requisite not that this be good in very truth, but that it be apprehended as good. Of course, this is a very key idea. It's not that something has to actually be good. You might do something that's really bad, but the reason why you did it is because you apprehended it as good. We make a lot of mistakes. And so sometimes we choose something because we think this is what's going to make life better, that's going to work, it's going to solve all of these consequences, or it's because it's following this rule, and then you find out, nope, you made a mistake. Aquinas doesn't say that it's not getting its character from what is actually the effect, but what the apprehension is leading into it. So notice again that everything that we want it because we perceive it as a good. He's not arguing that all things we want are good, but only that we perceive them as such. This is connected to the ideas of utilitarianism, which look at the consequences, but unlike utilitarianism, whose consequences are primarily understood in the greatest happiness principle, Aquinas says that true goods are found in the fulfillment of God's desires and this heavenly beatitude, not in earthly goodness. Therefore, he states, we speak of man's last end as a thing which is the end. Thus all other things concur to man's last end, since God is the last end of man and of all other things. So does this mean for Aquinas that some good things are bad? Yes. And some bads are bad and some bads are all bad, but what is bad isn't usually always all bad. Usually what's bad, we're at least thinking, we're apprehending, we're choosing to do the bad because of a good that we see in it. This is grounded on the theology of Augustine, who in his Confessions talks about sin being a counterfeit liberty. We're pretending that it's a liberty. We're pretending that it's a freedom. And this is why we're doing it. Even though it might be something that enslaves us, we're choosing it because we think that it is good. Properly speaking, for both Aquinas and for Augustine, who he gets this theology from, evil is the privation of good. Evil is the lack of good, and yet it's also apprehended, at least in this case, because of the good that we perceive in it. So, does this mean that Aquinas saves hedonism, or possibly even utilitarianism? Does the fact that we're apprehending something as good, or we're choosing it because we think that it's going to have this consequence, both for ourselves and maybe for others, does that mean that it's all okay if we change our scope, if we broaden it out towards a theistic view? Or does that kind of weigh in all of new sets of problems? Does he present some sort of new modification of the greatest happiness principle? And this can only be done with God. Again, this might mean that we still have to deny ourselves, or at least deny ourselves in the short term, for what we anticipate and hope would be something good in the long term, in the permanent state of things. But until then, does this work? Can we hold on to it? I want to conclude today's discussion by encouraging you all to go watch the Experience Machine video. Think about what these experiences mean. Whether or not theistic hedonism saves hedonism, or utilitarianism, or egoism, or anything else. What value do we have with our experiences? What value do they have if they're real or not? How are we going to be challenged by this, and how should we move and proceed? So use the remaining time that you would normally be spending discussing these things with watching that video and engaging with this as well. Thank you.